Just an interesting idea. We know that we're, still in Chodesh Av, and for those of you who are Yerushalmim, we've just finished Purim yesterday, last night, and we had it out fast. Parazim, we had it just before, and we know there's the inyan of Mishenichnas Adar Ma'abim B'Simcha, as we learn in the Gemara in Ta'anit, and there's a perplexing comment there by Rashi. Rashi there says, "What does it mean Mishenichnas Adar Ma'abim B'Simcha?" Of course, we know the answer is because of Purim. But Rashi there actually explains that in his Perush there in the Gemara in Ta'anit, that these are particularly special days of Yemei Nisim, and says Rashi, Purim v'Pesach, Purim u'Pesach. And the question is, all of the Achronim grapple on why it is that Rashi is saying Purim u'Pesach, meaning Mishnechnas Adar Marbim b'Simcha. The focus should be Purim. And there's various explanations by the Achronim, but it seems that the Machaneh Meshutaf, the common denominator between all of the explanations, is that when we have a retzef, a continuity of chagim one after the other, we build momentum. And therefore, it seems that's what Rashi is saying, that it doesn't just stop with Purim. Therefore, Rashi in his Perush there in Masechet Ta'anit says that the simcha doesn't stop after Purim. Purim or Pesach, and we move forward to the next Chag. And therefore, we find ourselves obviously just after Purim, but at the same time also Hachana, preparation towards Pesach. And we know that by Yamim Him as Manazel, we find ourselves in truly special times. So we should have chizuk from the retzef of events, and Bezrat Hashem, we shouldn't have besorot tovot. And we know that in a leap year, although we have a Shana Pshuta regular year now, but in a leap year, we know that the reason the halacha is that we celebrate Purim in Adar Bet rather than Adar Aleph. We know it's machloket in Chazal, but ultimately, the halacha, we rule that the Purim is celebrated in Adar Bet, not Adar Aleph, is because we want to juxtapose Geula li Geula. That Purim should be in the second Adar, and therefore it's close to Pesach. The Geula of Purim should be adjacent to the Geula of Pesach. So there really is something special in being able to have this retzef, this momentum and continuity that we build going from one Chag to the other. And so to that effect, now we sort of move away from Purim. We're going to build off of, not move away from Purim, but to build a one level higher, and we're going to have a look at Inyanei Pesach. So thank you so much to all of you for participating. If there is an azakah, I mean, I don't apologize, but my family will also enter the mamad, and hopefully they'll be quiet. But I try to start in the mamad so that we can continue to learn. So we're going to look today at the various dinim in Hilchot Leil HaSeder, in the halachot of the Seder night, and see how, on the one hand, we have a list of many chagim, many traditions, but alongside all of those traditions, all of those chagim, we know that there are very.
Can you make it larger, please, so that it'll be easier for everyone
larger,
to see?
sure.
Thank you.
There we go. No worries. Is that good? Is that better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay, Mule. It's great.
Much better.
So we find ourselves right, looking now preparation for Leil HaSeder, and we're going to look at various chagim, various halachot rather, towards Leil HaSeder, which sometimes seem very intricate, very niche, and very dry. But what I'd like to demonstrate today and learn with you this morning is the notion that many of these halachot, which seem to be dry or technical, very niche halachot, are all geared towards what I call the experiencing of Leil HaSeder. So both by looking at the texts of Chazal and the Mishnah and the Gemara, but also in the writings of the Rishonim and the Shulchan Aruch, we're going to see how some halachot, which are well known to us, and perhaps we haven't even thought about in this context, are all geared towards the Seder experience. We know that Leil HaSeder is really the ultimate chinuch lesson. The notion of ba'avur zeh. And as we say in the Haggadah, that was in some sense supposed to say ba'avur zeh, and it's supposed to be this experience which is happening right now at the Seder that we are reenacting. And we know this from the Mishnayot in Masechet Psachim, and that's what we're going to start with in source 1. The Mishnah, the very long Mishnah in the 10th parak of Psachim, says as follows in source 1. Says the Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel haya omer, Kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach, lo yetze yedei chavato, So we know this because this Mishnah is then copied into the text of the Haggadah that we say in Magid. Says Rabbi Gamliel, anyone who does not say the following three things on Pesach has not fulfilled their obligation of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, of recounting the Exodus. The Eluhain, and they are as follows, as we all know, Pesach, Matzah, Umaror. And we know that the Mishnah, and also as we copy that text into the Haggadah, then proceeds to expound on the meaning of each of these three key terms, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. There's this idea that the experience of the mitzvot on the table, which we'll discuss later, is paramount to fulfilling the mitzvah of the Sipur, Mitzrayim, of recounting the Exodus. But then the Mishnah continues, as again we say at the Seder table, Chol dor vadar, chayav adam lirot et atzmo, ki'ilu hu yatsa mitzrayim. It's a famous line we know from the Haggadah, but its sources in the Mishnah here. In each and every generation, a person is obligated to view themselves as if they have left Mitzrayim. And how do we prove this? We prove this from the end of Parshat Bo. Shene'emar, as it says in Shemot Yud Gimel, the end of Parshat Bo, right after Yetziat Mitzrayim, V'higalta levincha bayam ahu leimor, ba'avur ze asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mitzrayim. You should tell your child, V'higalta levincha, on that day, that ba'avur ze, for this, Hashem performed for me when I left Mitzrayim. So we know there's this idea of ba'avur ze asa Hashem li, and it seems that the focus is on the command, the mandate to tell the next generation, V'higalta levincha. And therefore, in each and every generation, a person is obligated, and as we do at the Seder table, lirot et atzmo, to view themselves as if they have just left Mitzrayim. That is the Mishnah, and as with the text that we've canonized into our Haggadah, and we say at Magid. However, whilst that's where the Tanaim leave things, Rava, in one of the Amoraim of the Gemara, goes one stage further. And he says here at the end of source 1, Amar Rava, says Rava, it's not sufficient to view as if you left Mitzrayim and all these things that we said in the Mishnah, but rather says the Gemara, Amar Rava, says Rava, Sarich sheyomar, person has to say, V'otanu hotzi misham. Hashem took us out from there. And the question is, what is it that Rava is adding by this line? And this is in fact a line that we do say towards the end of Magid, V'otanu hotzi misham. But is it not sufficient what we've already said? The person is supposed to view themselves as if they left Mitzrayim. As the Mishnah says, the words of Rabbi Gamliel, you're supposed to say these three key terms and expound them, Pesach, Matzah, Umarah. What is Rava actually adding here when he says, Sarich Shiomar, also at the Seder you have to add the words, Ve'otanu hotzi misham. So the words, Ve'otanu hotzi misham, are a reference to a pasuk in Parshat Et Chanan. If we skip for 1 second down to source 3 here, the Gemara, the Torah rather in Parshat V'et Chanan tells us as follows: that ki isha vincha macha leimar ma edot v'achtim mishpatim, etc. When your child tells you in the future, this is Moshe Rabbeinu speaking to the generation about to enter the land. What are all these laws which Hashem commands you? So you're supposed to tell him that avadim hayinu l'fara b'mitzrayim, and then in the final pasuk there in source 3, what does the father tell the son? V'otanu hotzi misham. Hashem took us out from there. Leman havi otanu latet lanu et haaretz asher nishba la'avotenu. That Hashem took us out from there, from Mitzrayim, in order to bring us this land. So the context of this pasuk, which Rava in the Gemara here in source 1 is telling us we have to add to the Magid, V'otanu hotzi misham, is coming basically in the context there of the generation entering the land who is telling their children who never experienced the Midbar, never experienced any part of Yetziat Mitzrayim, or even the second generation who didn't hear about it or were not children, because we know there was a decree at least on all the men above the age of 20 who died out in the Midbar. But the next generation who never experienced Mitzrayim, or their parents never experienced Mitzrayim at all, know that you entered the land as part of a promise of Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's the context of this pasuk. But what is this pasuk actually coming to add from the other themes already mentioned in the Gemara and the Mishnah? Perhaps we can look at this and understand this a bit better by analyzing the Rambam. Because when the Rambam paskins this entire Mishnah and Gemara, when he brings all of these dinim and his laws of Hachametz and Matzah in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam makes a few subtle but significant changes. So we're going to play a little game of spot the difference here. So it's kind of good that we have the screen. Famously, the Rambam makes a change, or either had an alternative variated text in the Gemara of the Mishnah, or had a different text or different tradition, or in his Perush is trying to change things. But there's one more famous one and some less more subtle, less well-known and more subtle changes. But look at the original Mishnah here in source 1, B'chol dar vadar, as we know from the Seder, versus how the Rambam actually cites this in his halachot in the Mishnah Torah in source 2. So if we look at the Rambam as opposed to the Mishnah which we say, the Rambam says as follows in source 2. It says as follows. B'chol dor vador, in each and every generation, chayav adam laharot et atzmo ki'ilu hu ba'atzmo yatsa ata mishibud Mitzrayim. So already there we have some very subtle but significant changes. We look at the original Mishnah here, if I'm highlighting here in source 1. B'chol dor vador, chayav adam laharot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa Mitzrayim. Look how the Rambam changes this in source 2. B'chol dor vador, chayav adam, not lirot, but laharot et atzmo כאילו הוא בעצמו יצא תא משעבוד מצרים. So the Rambam in this line which I've just highlighted makes a few subtle but significant changes. The difference between lirot and laharot, the grammarians among us will know that lirot is in the kal, a person is supposed to view themselves, whereas laharot is in the hif'il, in the causative. Lirot et atzmo means you're supposed to view yourself. So how does one view oneself as they left Mitzrayim? So you close your eyes and you imagine what it must have been like to leave Mitzrayim. In contrast, the Rambam doesn't have the variation, or at least in his halacha, doesn't bring the word lirot like the original Mishnah, but rather brings the word famously laharot. I don't know if there are any temanim on the shiur today, but the minhag of temanim in their Haggadah is like the Rambam, and they don't say lirot at the Seder table. That they actually at the end of Magid, when they cite this passage, the temanim say laharot. So, firstly, the Rambam sort of exacerbates or enhances the idea of viewing oneself and the experiential element of the Seder. So this is an important point already. It's not enough, according to the Rambam, lirot et atzmo, to see and view yourself as if you left Mitzrayim, but rather laharot, you have to display, to show, to essentially to enact and reenact as if you left Mitzrayim. And this is highlighted by the other additions the Rambam makes. The Mishnah had said, Ki'ilu hu yatsa Mitzrayim, as if he had left Mitzrayim. What does the Rambam do? He says, laharot et atzmo, Ki'ilu hu be'atzmo, Yetza ata mishud Mitzrayim. The Rambam, as if he himself has left just now from the slavery of Egypt. And therefore the Rambam is emphasizing here the experiential, the paramount element of the experiential aspect of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. On Seder night, says the Rambam, it's not just enough to close your eyes and lirot, to imagine, to view what it must have been like to leave Mitzrayim. You have to laharot, you have to reenact, you have to demonstrate. You have to put on the plays and all the things that we do for the kids and grandkids, where we act as if we're leaving Mitzrayim. Not just lirot, but laharot. And that's an important change there in the Rambam. But there is one further changes as well, besides the lirot and laharot, and that is in Sukkim, the verses that the Rambam cites to back up this halacha. What had the Mishnah originally said? How do we know that in each and every generation the person is obligated to view themselves if they left Mitzrayim? It brings the pasuk from the end of Parsha Bo, the famous pasuk we all know, that you've got to tell it over to your child, to the next generation, ba'avur zeh. Fascinating that the Rambam omits this pasuk entirely. And if we look at the Rambam, if we go back down to source 2, what does the Rambam bring us the pasuk? As if a person left Mitzrayim, Shneimar, as it says, he does not cite the pasuk of V'gad lavincha as the proof that you're supposed to imagine that you've left Mitzrayim, but he brings which pasuk, lo and behold, from Pasha Ve'et Chanan. Shneimar, as it says in Sefer Devarim, V'otanu otzi misham, and he took us out from there. In other words, what pasuk does the Rambam do? Remember the structure of the Mishnah and Gemara. The Mishnah has said each generation you've got to view yourself you left Mitzrayim. It cites the pasuk of V'gad lavincha. And then Rava later on in the Gemara adds an additional dimension of Tzarech Yomar, the person is supposed to say that we ourselves as if we had left. The Rambam omits this entire section of the Mishnah, and he backs up the idea of B'chol Dor Vador, and he jumps straight to Rava's pasuk, and that's exactly what we see here in the Rambam. Further emphasizing that the Rambam, it's not just enough lirot, to imagine what it was like to leave Mitzrayim, to view, to close your eyes and think about and view what it must have been if we left Mitzrayim, but laharot. In some sense, we're reenacting, we're actually leaving Mitzrayim in the here and now. And that is why it seems the Rambam skips pasuk of V'gad lavincha. Because this is not just about telling the next generation, but it's rather, as the Rava points out in the Gemara, V'otanu hotzi misham. You and I right now are leaving Mitzrayim. And therefore, the Rambam is able to, as it were, skip over the V'Gadta Levincha pasuk, which is about Midar Ladar from generation to generation, and instead, in his Lahar Ot way of looking at things, the reenactment that we right now are leaving Mitzrayim, he instead just cites the pasuk that Rava brings in the Gemara. V'otzanu, v'otanu hotzi misham. And that is the power of Seder night, according to the Rambam. Not just lirot, but lahalot. Not just to imagine what it's like to leave Mitzrayim, but to act as if we right now, v'otanu hotzi misham, are leaving Mitzrayim in the here and now. And this idea seems to be emphasized further by what the Rambam then proceeds to bring in the continuation there in source 2. What does the Rambam say? He says that al davar zeh tzivah kadosh baruch hu b'Torah. This idea was supposed to reenact as if we left Mitzrayim, was commanded by Hashem in the Torah, and he quotes from, again for Pasha Et Hanan, this time from the Aseret HaDibrot. What does it say in the Aseret HaDibrot? We know two sets of Aseret HaDibrot, one in Pashat Yitro and another one in Pashat Ve'et Hanan. And in Pashat Ve'et Hanan, so we have the mitzvah Shabbat, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat Lekadshon, instead of Zachor. And what's the rationale which is presented in Pashat Ve'et Hanan? We're told, V'zacharta ki evet hayita. We have to ensure we keep Shabbat, but also our avadim keep Shabbat. And why? Says the Torah, V'zacharta, you shall remember, ki evet hayita, that you were an eved. Says the Rambam, what does this mean? Kolomar, this means ki'ilu ata ba'atzmacha hayita eved, as if you yourself were a slave, v'yatzata lecherut v'nifteta, and you were freed and were redeemed. In other words, the Rambam again takes a pasuk which seems to be wholly out of context in the mitzvah of Shmirat Shabbat in the Aseret Dibrot. But this phrase, "V'zacharta ki eved hayita," you should remember that you were an eved, means, says the Rambam, we're supposed to imagine that ata ba'atzmacha, you yourself on Seder night are in the guise, as you're in the persona, as if you yourself were an eved and you were freed and redeemed. And this is really what we're trying to display in the shiur today. That not just lirot, but as the Rambam says, laharot. That we are not just imagining what it was like and viewing ourselves as if what it would have been like to leave Mitzrayim, but we in the here and now are leaving. And we use the psukim of v'otanu hotzi misham and v'zacharta ki eved hayita. We ourselves, in some sense, even 3.5 millennia later, nonetheless, are looking back and saying it as if we ourselves are leaving Mitzrayim right now. And it seems that this is precisely what the Mishnah was saying about the idea of having to say Pesach, Matzah, Umarar, and what I mentioned in the pasuk that we all know of, Ba'avur Zeh. And in fact, this is a famous line of Rav Soloveitchik in his Yahrzeit Shiurim in the memory of his father, where he says in source 4, says Rav Soloveitchik, Ata mechuyav lo rak lagid milim b'peh. When it comes to the mitzvah of Sipir Tzim Mitzrayim on Seder night, we're obligated not merely to verbalize with words the Haggadah, im gam lekayem et Haggadah. You're supposed to actually fulfill, bring the Haggadah to life, make it kayam, bring it to life. V'latet bitoy lesimchatcha v'hitlavutcha alidei pu'ulot u'ma'asim. And you're supposed to give expression to your joy and your excitement through actions. And this is exactly based on what the Rambam has said, that the mitzvah is not just lirot et atzmo, but on Seder night we're obligated in Sipur Yitzim Mitzrayim lahavot et atzmo. We're supposed to reenact, and this is why we have all these pu'ulot u'ma'asim. And this, of course, leads us to another important piece in Magid, which is what we know it as Yachal, right? Yachal merosh chodesh, Talmud lomar bayom hahu, right? The famous line in Magid that you might have thought that we should do the mitzvah on Rosh Chodesh, and therefore the Torah tells us otherwise bayom hahu. No, it's on Seder night. A slightly variation of what appears in the Haggadah appears in the Midrashim, in the Mechilta here in source 5, but it's the same idea if we look in source 5. And it comes to highlight this notion further of re-experiencing or experience, the Seder experience, rather than just Sipur as a Seder story. Says that, say Chazal, similar to the Yachal that we all know from Yachal Merosh Chodesh from Magid, say Chazal in the Mechilta and the Midrash in source 5, you should tell your children, you might have thought that when was the original command given in Shemot Perek Yud Bet, it was given on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. You might think the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzim Mitzrayim could be already fulfilled on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Talmud Lomar, the Torah teaches us otherwise. No, Bayomahu. It's supposed to be on that day. What does that day mean? That day means Lichora, the day of Pesach. I Bayomahu, and this again is we simply say a similar variation of this in the Haggadah. If it's that day, meaning Pesach, Yachal Miba'od Yom. You might think that already during the daytime, when we bring the Korban Pesach, that is when we should do the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. So if you imagine on Erev Pesach instead of on Seder night, on Erev Pesach, that's when we should get together and do the Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, because that's when the Korban would have been offered. Again, the Torah tells us otherwise. Talmud Lomar, ba'avur zeh, for this. What does it mean, ba'avur zeh? This is a line that we all know from the Haggadah and in the various variations of Yachol. Ba'avur zeh, or ba'basha'ah sheyesh matzah umarar munachim lefanecha. When do we do the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim? At the time when the matzah amara is placed before you, or in the version of the Mechilta, it adds two more words after that, al shulchancha, on your table. In other words, there is something inherently connected between the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim and the experiential aspect of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the matzah amara being placed on the table. And this is learned out by those famous words, ba'avur zeh, that the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim can only possibly be fulfilled at the time when the matzah amara is in front of us on the table. Why? Because the story has to have props, because it's not just a narrative that we're telling, but rather it's an experience that we are trying to reenact. And therefore, if we do not have the matzah amara in front of us, then this is not the zman, this is not the halachic time to fulfill the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, and that is learnt by the words ba'avur zeh. We're going to see now that the Gemara takes these words ba'avur zeh, not only learns them about the timing of the story of when the Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim and the inherent requirement to have the experiential aspect of the matzah amara on the table as a prerequisite to fulfill the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, but rather the Gemara takes this not just about the timing, but really takes this seriously, this notion of having to have the matzah amara on the table. And that we're going to look at in the next source here, in source 6 and 7, the Gemara in Pesachim, in two stages. The first bit will be more familiar to us, and the second bit perhaps less so. The first bit is a halacha that some of us might think is narishkeit, but is actually a explicit halacha in the Gemara, which is that when we get to those elements of Pesach, Matzah, and Marah, we are actually supposed to lift or point to the Matzah and the Marah, or traditionally lift it. And this is not just a cute idea that when we say Matzah zo sha'anu ochlim al shumah, that we lift the Matzah, but it's actually a halacha in the Gemara. In source 6 says the Gemara, Amarava says Rava, Matzah tzarich l'hagbiyah. When you get to that point in the Haggadah, where you say Matzah zo, and you explain the rationale for the Matzah, you need to lift it. Umarar tzarich l'hagbiyah. And similarly, when you get to Marah zeh, tzarich l'hagbiyah, you're supposed to lift the marah. So this isn't just a cute thing we do to show the kids, look, it's the matzah and the marah. It's actually an explicit halacha in the Gemara. That when you get to matzah zo and you get to marah zeh, that bit in the Haggadah, Pesach matzah marah, you have to lift them. Now, of course, we know that when you say Pesach nowadays, since the Churban, we don't lift the zeroah. Basar ein tzarich l'hagbiyah. Right? You don't need to lift the zeroah when you say Pesach. But not only do you not need to lift it, but you're not supposed to lift it. Because if you were to lift it, it implies that you're eating a korban outside the Beit HaMikdash, something which is prohibited. So that we don't lift, obviously, the zeroah when we say Pesach. But nonetheless, matzah tzarech l'hagbiyah umarat tzarech l'hagbiyah. That there's this idea of ba'avur zeh we take very literally. It's not just about the timing, but in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Sipur, and remember, Rabban Gamliel teaches us, if you don't say the words Pesach, Matzah, or Marah and expound them at the Seder, you've not fulfilled your mitzvah of Sipur. Says Rava, by the way, it's the same Rava who adds that pasuk that the Rambam loved so much. V'otanu hotzi b'sham. It's no less the same Rava who says, not just enough to have them on the table. You've got to actually lift the matzah and you've got to lift the marah. If not, there's something missing in your story. Your sipur is too abstract and too removed. Only when you lift the matzah and you lift the marah, which is a halachic requirement, not just a cute activity for the kids, it's a halachic requirement that enhances your ability to experience the sipur and to reenact it. And that's the first halacha, which is known, an activity, a practice which is known to us, which is an inherent part of the mitzvah of Sipur, is to lift the matzah and lift the marah, literally ba'avur zeh. But what's interesting, and although we don't paskin this way, the position of Rav Achar Bar Yaakov in the Gemara, because he takes this to an absolute extreme. And although we don't rule like him, we don't halachically follow him, nonetheless, it's a fascinating position in the Gemara, which I'd like us to look at. Rav Achar Bar Yaakov, what Rava started to develop here, Rav Achar Bar Yaakov takes to an absolute extreme in source 7. Says Rav Achar Bar Yaakov as follows. He takes this notion of ba'avur zeh very literally. And he says as follows in source 7. It says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Suma, a blind person, Hatur Melomar Haggadah. We don't paskin this way, important disclaimer. But nonetheless, Rav Acha bar Yaakov rules that a blind person is exempt from the Haggadah. Blind person is exempt from the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. Why? He learns out a Gezerah Shava, an association from the word Zeh in Ba'avur Zeh, by us, and in a totally different context. The Tiv Hachar, it says here, regarding the Haggadah and Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, Ba'avur Zeh, for this. Uchtiv Hatam, and it says there, anyone knows where this is? B'neinu Zeh. B'neinu Zeh. Anyone know where that is? Give it away. B'neinu Zeh, Sorer Umoreh. So this is in Pasha Kitetse, by the Ben Sorer Umoreh, the wayward and rebellious son, whose parents simply cannot control him. And what we told there, that his parents, V'tafsuvo aviv imo, his parents, they seize him and they bring him to Beit Din, and they point to him and they say, "B'neinu zeh sorer umoreh, einenu shomer b'kolenu." Right, our son, he's a glutton and a drunk, and he won't listen to us. And Chazal in Masechet Sanhedrin learn out from the fact that it says zeh, "B'neinu zeh," that they have to be able to see him. Because how else can they say this son? They need to know with absolute conviction that it's their son in front of us who's being tried by Beit Din. And therefore, Chazal in Sanhedrin learned that if one of the parents is blind, then they cannot render their son a Ben Sorer Umoreh. And therefore, B'neinu Zeh. So the word Zeh by Ben Sorer Umoreh comes to exclude if one of the parents is blind. Says the Gemara, the same way it says the word Zeh by Ben Sorer Umoreh excludes the case where one of them is blind. So too, says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, when it comes to the Seder table, Avur Zeh, the word Zeh excludes somebody who is blind. Ma lahalan, just like there in the case of Ben Sorer Umoreh, Prat l'suma comes to exclude the case of a blind person who cannot be tried as a Ben Sorer Umoreh. Afkan, so to here in our case, Prat l'sumim. It comes to exclude blind people. Blind people, says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, are exempt from the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim and the mitzvah of Haggadah. What is going on here? Why on earth should blind people be exempt from a Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim? It seems a little bit far-fetched, and of course we don't rule this way, and we'll see in a moment the Gemara is going to reject it. But nonetheless, it seems that Rav Acha bar Yaakov is teaching us a fundamental principle. He takes this notion of the experiential aspect of the Seder to such an extreme that if you cannot see the matzah and maror on the table, there is something lacking in your story, and therefore your story simply isn't good enough. That seems to be what Rav Acha bar Yaakov is teaching us. And though we don't rule this way, and we rule that blind people are obligated nonetheless in the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, in the Haggadah, the extreme direction that Rav Acha bar Yaakov takes this in teaches us something very important, that the Seder experience, the Sipur is a Seder experience. And that's why he suggests, although we don't rule that way, the halacha, nonetheless, he suggests that a blind person who cannot see the matzah on the table, cannot see the marar, and when all of us are pointing and saying, matzah zo sha'anu ochlim al shumma, and marar zeh sha'anu ochlim al shumma, since the blind person cannot see the lettuce, cannot see the crispy lettuce on the table, cannot see whether you've got your nice Ashkenazi hard matzahs or you've got your Temani, Sfaradi, lafas, whatever your particular persuasion and minhag, he cannot see that on the table. Says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, his story is simply not good enough. It's not sufficient, and therefore it must be, if he cannot say marar zo, see the marar, like the parent of the Ben Sorer Umoreh, if he cannot take their child to Beit Din and say b'neinu zeh with absolute conviction, this is the son of ours, they cannot try him as a Ben Sorer Umoreh in Beit Din. Similarly, says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, if he cannot see the matzah, cannot see the marar on the table, then there's something lacking in his story, and it must be, says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, he is exempt from the Haggadah. While this is a strong hava amina, a strong first thought in the Gemara, ultimately his position is rejected, but nonetheless, from the very position of Rav Acha bar Yaakov, we see the great importance of the experiential aspect to Yetziat Mitzrayim, not just, and Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, not just the telling of the story, but experiencing everything going on around us. So when you talk about Yachal, this year at the Seder table, and you say Ba'avur Zeh, remember this position of Rav Acha bar Yaakov and what he teaches us, about the paramount experience of Sipur, and not just as words, but as a real experience, ba'avur zeh, in the literal sense. We'll just see inside how the Gemara ultimately rejects this position, but nonetheless, it's a fascinating one to learn together. So the Gemara says, is this really true? Inni, is this so that a blind person is exempt from Sipur, from Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim? V'ha'amar Marema, surely Marema says, Sha'altin l'Rabbanan de'bei Rav Yosef. I asked the rabbis in the Beit Midrash of Rav Yosef, Man da'ama agadata be Rav Yosef. Who leads the Haggadah? Who leads the Seder in Rav Yosef's house? Amru, and they responded, Rav Yosef. Now, Rav Yosef is the one who leads the Haggadah in his home. Now, important piece of information here, Rav Yosef and also Rav Sheshet, as we'll see in a moment, they were both blind. Now, yet we see from here, he led the Haggadah in his house. So that seems to show, unlike Rav Acha bar Yaakov, that blind people are nonetheless obligated in the Haggadah. And similarly, I asked, Man da'ama agata be Rav Sheshet, who leads the Haggadah in the house of Rav Sheshet? Amru, and his Talmidim said, Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet, of course, is the one who leads the Haggadah. So the fact that Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshet ultimately were head of the table, had led the Seder and led the Haggadah in their respective households, teaches us, clearly, unlike Rav Acha bar Yaakov's position, a blind person is in fact obligated in the say in Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, in the Haggadah. Ella, rather, the Gemara then rejects Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov and says, what does it mean ba'avur zeh? It doesn't mean that you have to see the matzah, but ba'avur matzah marahu da'ata. The ba'avur means for this matzah which you know is in front of you. In other words, you don't have to see the matzah. You just have to know it's the zman for matzah. And think about, I don't know, a chayal out in the shetach, or a COVID type seder where, or whatever, unfortunate circumstances. If unfortunately person was unable to procure matzah and maror, nonetheless they'd still have a Torah obligation to recite the Haggadah of the Sipur. In other words, it's true they're required, but it's not having the matzah maror is not enough to exempt you from the Sipur. So ultimately, as I said, the position of Acha bar Yaakov, who holds that a blind person is exempt from the Haggadah, from the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, that position is ultimately rejected. Nonetheless, it's a fascinating lumdus, it's a fascinating position to be aware of because of what it shows us about the importance of the experiential aspect of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. So thus far, what have we seen? We have seen, if we just pan back here, we've seen the original Mishnah, which becomes canonized as part of the text of a Haggadah in Magid, of B'chol Dor V'Dor. We've seen the fact that the Rambam really takes this to extreme by not just lir'ot et atzmo, the person is supposed to view themselves and imagine what they did to leave Mitzrayim, but rather lahar'ot et atzmo. You're supposed to reenact and display and convey yourself as if you, but atzmo yourself, yatza'ata, have just left right now from Shibud Mitzrayim. He brings the secondary pasuk of Rava in the Gemara, who says that you're supposed to say va'otanu hotzi misham, something which we do say in the Haggadah. The Rambam brings it in his halachot, in Hilchot Chametz U'Matzah, as the primary pasuk, actually skipping out the pasuk of Igadta Levincha, which is fascinating, and highlights the fact that you've got to imagine that you yourself were an Eved, v'yatzata lecherut v'nifteta, and were redeemed and freed. And we've seen about the idea of ba'avur zeh, which is taken literally. By Rava, it's a halachic requirement to lift the matzah and maror, as we do today. We don't lift the korban pesach, we don't have it, we don't lift the zarah, because of technical halachic prohibitions of looking like we're offering korban outside the mikdash. And Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who takes this idea of ba'avur zeh really literally to an absolute extreme, who exempts a blind person from Haggadah, which is learned out from Ben Sora or Moreh, because if you cannot see the matzah, there's something lacking with your Sipur. Just like the parent of the Ben Sora Marahu, if he cannot see the Ben who's misbehaving in the household, he cannot with conviction stand in front of the Beit Din and say, B'nai Nuzeh, he is a wayward and rebellious son, because the experience is part of the mitzvah, an inherent part at that. And although we don't pass like Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov about a blind person, nonetheless, his extreme position teaches us something great about the nature of Sipur and the experiential element therein. There are some other niche and dry halachot, though, which we do rule the halacha, and are in fact also building up towards this notion of the experiential element of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. And that, of course, is the annual, well, I call it in my house, the annual charoset machloket, about how much charoset you're supposed to have. And my kids always like to sort of, rather than dipping their maror and charoset. Sometimes it feels like they're dipping the charoset in maror in terms of the ratio between charoset and maror and the amount. And do you shake it off? Do you not shake it off? And do you have charoset in your sandwich and do you not? There are discussions, not just minhagim, but halachic discussions surrounding the ratio of charoset or how it's supposed to be left on the maror. And again, the Gemara in Pesachim here in that 10th parak, which deals with the laws of Seder night, in source 8, the Gemara tells us as follows in source 8 about charoset in the maror. Va'amar Rav Papa, says Rav Papa, lo nishhei inish maror b'charoset. A person is not supposed to leave the maror dipped in the charoset for too long. Why? Dilma agav chalyel de tavlin mavtil leilim rore. Because perhaps due to the sweetness of all of the mixtures of the or the seasoning of the charoset, it might cancel out the morore. It might cancel out the bitterness. So says Rav Papa, you're not supposed to leave charoset on or totally, drown your maror in charoset or leave it in for too long, because the sweetness of the charoset might cancel out the bitterness of the maror. Uvainan ta'an marar veleka. And we require there to be a taste of maror, a taste of bitterness, veleka. And there isn't in this case. Now, what's this referring to? This is referring to the fact that the maror, of course, which is supposed to be a commemoration of the bitter times in Mitzrayim, is supposed to be part of the experience. And if you drown it in your very sweet charoset, depending whatever your family recipe happens to be, then you have missed the point. We don't just eat maror for the sake of eating the maror. We eat maror because of the experience that it provides for us, that bitterness. Your contact lenses flying out or whatever it might be, or your eyes watering up. That is supposed to be an important part of the mitzvah of Achilat maror. In fact, we see this in another halacha at the end of source 8 regarding somebody who eats it too quickly. Amar Rava, says Rava, Bala matzah, not recommended, yatsa. If you swallow your share of matzah whole, meaning you don't chew it, you don't allow it to go in the sides, you just swallow it in one go, not recommended. Well, choking hazard, that's a madness. Yatsa. Nonetheless, you fulfill your obligation. In contrast, says Rava, Bala marar, if you swallow the marar whole, in other words, doesn't touch the sides, just goes straight down, lo yatsa, you've not fulfilled your obligation. Why? The Rashbam, along the same lines, explains to us that we know that the last parak of Pesachim, we don't really have Rashi, or we don't have a finalized version of Rashi. Instead, we have on the daf his grandson Rashbam. And Rashbam explains this again in source 9. Bala mara lo yatsa, if you swallow the marar whole, you don't chew, you just swallow without chewing, you've not fulfilled your obligation of marar. In contrast to matzah, why? Says Rashbam, V'ba'inan tam marar veleka. See, he brings that same reason the Gemara had brought above as to why you're not supposed to drown your maror in charoset. The Rashbam also brings as the same reason as to why you're not supposed to swallow your maror without chewing. Because we require the taste of maror. You're supposed to taste the bitterness. Veleka. And if you swallow it whole, we don't have that here. That's not present. The Mishum Hachi, this is the whole reason, says the Rashbam, Hapid Rachmana lemarer et piv shel ochel. Sounds a little bit sadistic here. Right? Hashem was makpid to embitter the mouth of the eater. Why was Hashem insistent to embitter the mouth of the eater when he gives us the mitzvah of Marar? Zecher is a commemoration for Levaya Maru et Chayehem, for the pasuk, as we know from the opening parak of Sefer Shemot of the story of Shibud Mitzrayim, because by Yamaru et Chayehem the Egyptians made their lives bitter. So let's look at the way Rashbam phrases that. As I said, it sounds a little bit sadistic, but it's an important point here. Kapid rachmana lemarer et piv shel ochel. Hashem wanted, the Torah wanted to embitter the mouth of the eater. And therefore, somebody who swallows their mara whole, much like the previous example, somebody who drowns their mara in charoset and it therefore loses its sharpness, has missed the point, which is lemarer et piv shel ochel. When we sit there at Seder night, as we know, we're supposed to experience the bitterness. But these halachot about shaking off the charoset and not drowning it in the maror in charoset, and also somebody who wants to get it over and done with and just swallow the maror without letting it touch the sides, has not fulfilled their obligation because ba'inan ta marar veleka, because we require that bitterness. We have to have that experience of bitterness in order to truly get into the psyche, the mindset of the bitter times of Mitzrayim, commemorating that pasuk, of course, of Vayamaru et Chayhem. And therefore, halachot surrounding the maror are those such that they require the taste. On the one hand, not to cancel out with too much charoset, and on the other hand, not to eat it too quickly without chewing, because the inyan, the idea here is to experience the bitterness that is an inherent part of the mitzvah of maror. We see this experiential aspect not just with the sipur, not just with the maror, but with some of the other halachot as well. Now, I know you just had with Rabbi Sussman a shiur on the Arba Kosot, I believe. And we see this in the Arba Kosot here in source 10. The Rambam in the halachot there teaches us when it comes to picking wine, we know there are different people have different preferences. There are those Rishonim who rule there's an inyan, there's an idea to have red wine. The Rambam, interestingly enough, doesn't talk about red wine, but rather what's the Rambam's criteria of what is the preferred wine to have at the Seder, according to the position of the Rambam, is what he says here in source 10 for the Arba Kosot. Says the Rambam, Arba'at Kosot ha'elu, Sarich limzog otam. So I'll say what's that? Okay, let's see. So Arba Kosot ha'elu, these 4 cups, Sarich limzog otam, they have to be diluted, Kedei shetiyeh shtiya areva, that it should be a sweet drinking. Hakol lefi hayayin, ulefi da'at hashoteh, depending on every particular wine in question, and according to the da'at hashoteh, which means the mindset, really the personal preference of the drinker. Now, what does it mean here about diluting? We do have strict halachot about not to dilute, and Sfaradim are generally more machbir than Ashkenazim, not just on Seder night, but in general about Brei Pri Hagafen, and when a drink loses Brei Pri Hagafen on the ratio between water and wine. But we know the times of Chazal that their wine, because of the manufacturing, the fermentation process, was particularly strong, and therefore they used to have what was called yain mazuk. They needed to dilute their wine so that it would actually be enjoyable, as opposed to basically poison. And therefore, where in the manner that one would dilute the wine really depends on the wine in question. But what the Rambam says here is, how should the wine be done for the 4 cups? I'll say tonight, depends on the wine in question, according to the capacity or the preference of the drinker. Some people might like stronger wine, some people might like weaker wine. But why is it lefi da'at hashoteh, according to the preference of the drinker? Of course, if the whole purpose of the Arba Kosot is because, well, we know that Chazal tell us that Arba Kosot, they also correspond to the Arba Lashonot Gula, the 4 expressions of redemption, but also, of course, wine in and of itself is a great expression of chayrut, freedom. And therefore, free people, they have their pick of the wine, right? They don't have to settle for anything. They go for what they like. And therefore, the Rambam says, Hakol lefi yayin lefi dat hashoteh. Because if the drinker has a particular preference for this or that year of wine or whatever it might be, they like a Bordeaux, they like a Chardonnay, whatever it might be, a rich person, a free person, is in charge of their own wine and is also in charge of their own wine fridge. And therefore, everything is lefi dat hashoteh, based on their preference as to what they enjoy the most. And therefore, that while there are discussions this way and that way about certain types of wine, there's halachic discussions about red wine versus white wine. There's halachic discussions about grape juice with positions, on both sides. The Rambam, is interesting to note when he describes the halachot of Arba Kosot. Again, it seems to me that it's based on this idea of the experiential aspect of Yetziat Mitzrayim. He says if we're supposed to be reenacting freedom here, the free person chooses whatever wine they want, and that to me is what the Rambam seems to be saying here in these 3 words: lefi dat hashoteh, according to the preference or the capacity or the personalized desire of the particular drinker at hand. And therefore, if you ask the Rambam, what would the Rambam have at his Seder? Or whatever wine the Rambam preferred, that's what he would use for the Arba Kosot, because your expression of choice is the ultimate sign of freedom and the best way to experience freedom as a free person. So not just in the Sipur, not just in the Maror, but also in the Arba Kosot. What we're going to see now, though, the last few minutes of the shiur, is that these halachot are similarly relevant, and halachot which need to be technical halachot about this yes and no, and how we even do things, and not just about the sipur, not just about the maror, not just about the arba kosot, the wine, also about the matzah as well, because we know there's an inherent stira, an inherent contradiction when it comes to the matzah. The matzah, Because on the one hand, the matzah is described as lechem oni, bread of affliction, and which Chazal darshan also as being of ani, of a poor man's bread. But at the same time, the matzah is lechem cheirut. It's the bread which symbolizes our freedom and symbolizes the fact that Hashem took us out in an instant so quickly. V'lo yachlu lehitmameh, right? They were unable to delay any longer, and the fact that it wasn't even able to rise is an expression of the ultimate freedom. And there's this inherent contradiction here as to the purpose of the matzah, which also is expressed in a machloket regarding the matzot themselves. Now, most of us, I believe, following the position of the Shulchan Aruch, have 3 matzot at the table. This is what the Shulchan Aruch rules in source 11, as does the Rosh and many of the Ashkenazi Rishonim, some Sephardi as well. And it says in source 11 as follows, says the Shulchan Aruch, Yitol yadav v'yivarech al netilat yadayim. So a person is supposed to do netilat yadayim. This is now referring to rochza. After we've done magid, we get to rochza. We do netilat yadayim. V'yikach hamatzot k'seder shenicham. You're supposed to take the matzahs in the order that you left them. Haprusa ben shtei hashlemot. You have the broken matzah between the 2 whole ones, right? We broke the middle matzah at yachatz, and therefore we have a whole matzah on the top and below. And the prusa, we have a broken one which we broke at yachatz. The bigger piece has been put away for afikoman, and now we have the smaller piece in the middle. And this is what most of us do. Now, why is it that we have 3 matzot? So there's all nice votim about Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael, and all other votim. But the real source for having 3 matzot is a halachic one, because we know that there is a requirement on Yom Tov for lechem mishneh. Shabbat and Yom Tov, you have to have 2 loaves because of the man. And if we look here, one of the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, we'll just skip for a second to source 13. The Ateret Tzvi, one of the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, says just that here. Why do we have to have a 3rd matzah? It's because when you break one of the matzahs at Yachatz, you don't have lechem mishnah, so you have to add a 3rd matzah to ensure that you still have 2 whole loaves because of the requirement, nothing to do with Pesach or the Seder, but to do with the requirement of lechem mishnah, right? Because you've got to have 2 whole matzah. And the Ateret Tzvi says this in source 13. Haprusa, you've got to take broken one, but still have 2 whole ones. Because it's insufficient to have 1 whole matzah and a broken matzah. It's no worse than any other Yom Tov and Shabbat, by the way. We have a requirement of lechem mishnah. And that is the position of the Shulchan Aruch, and what most of us do based on the Rosh and other Rishonim as well. The Rambam doesn't rule that way. The Rambam did not have 3 matzot at his Seder and says that 2 are sufficient. Even when you break 2 and you're left with 1 and a bit, that still suffices. And let's see this Rambam here inside in source 12 and explain why this should be the case. Says the Rambam here in source 12, and again, Hilchot Chametz U'Matzah, he says, V'achar kach mavarech al netilat yadayim. So he says here, the Rambam, V'achar kach mavarech al netilat yadayim. So you do rochza. V'notel yadav shnia. You wash your hands again, because you already did it at urchatz. This is now rochza. You wash your hands again. Shaharei hesiach da'ato b'shat kriyat haggadah. Because you might have been busy in your hands during the Haggadah, during Magid, so you have to wash them again for rochza. V'lokeach shnei rekikin. You take 2 loaves, meaning 2 matzahs. Cholek echad mehen. You break one of them. U'meniach parus l'toch shalem. And you put the whole one, the broken one, together with the whole one. U'mavarech hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and you make motzi. And then you're going to eat. You're going to do achilat matzah in a minute. Before we get to the explanation, a couple of things to note here. Firstly, where does the Rambam hold you do yachatz? His kids obviously came home from Ghana and sung the song a bit differently. Kadesh Urchatz Karpas. He doesn't do yachatz before Magid. The Rambam was very clear. Where did he do yachatz? Right before Hamotzi. Let's read that again. He says you do rochza, you do netilat yadayim. Then lokech shnei rukikim, you take 2 matzahs. Cholek echad mehem, you break one of them. In other words, you do yachatz not before Magid, according to the Rambam. You do yachatz right before Hamotzi. You take the broken one together with the whole one. So he's only got 1 and a bit matzahs, not 2 and a bit like we do. And you make Hamotzi. So that's firstly the Rambam. We're after the Rambam, but the Rambam differs to our minhag in the sense that he does yachatz right before Hamotzi. He doesn't do it earlier in the Seder. That's one important point, which we'll come back to. But for our intents and purposes, an important point is the Rambam rules that you don't have three matzahs such that you're left with two whole ones. It suffices to have one and a bit. And the Rambam's aware that we're all shouting, what's going on here? And he says, don't worry, I'll address it. He says here at the end of source 12, why is it that you don't make hamotzi on two whole loaves like every other Yom Tov and Shabbat where you need lechem mishneh? Because it says lechem oni. It calls it the bread of affliction, which Chazal darshan and expound not just to mean oni, but ani, like a poor person. Mad ani b'prusa, afkan b'prusa. The same way that an ani, a poor person, doesn't have whole loaves. He can't afford a whole loaf of bread or matzah. He only has a broken piece. So too, on Seder night, if the matzah is supposed to be lechem oni or lechem ani, a poor person's bread, then we should suffice with a prusa, with a broken piece of matzah. And therefore, says the Rambam, well, he can really be saying one of two things. We have conflicting values here. We have, on the one hand, the requirement for lechem mishnah, not because of Seder night, because of Hilchot Yom Tov and Shabbat. On the other hand, we have the requirement of not just the Seder night, but the Seder experience, as we've been learning today. And when these two values conflict, what do? Says the Rambam, and again, we don't rule this way necessarily, but though the Gra does, and maybe that some people who follow the Hagim of the Gra rules this way like the Rambam, but most of us do like the Shulchan Aruch. But nonetheless, the Rambam held that no, the requirement to be like an ani when you eat the matzah overrides the requirement of Hilchot Yom Tov for Lechem Mishnah. That seems to be one way to read it. And therefore, again, it's this idea of reenacting the Seder. I would take it one step further, though. And this is to do with the other halacha I mentioned, the other deviation from our minhag, which is not just about the number of matzot, but when one breaks it. We do yachatz before Magid, and then we have the broken piece throughout Magid, right? Halach ma'anya, and we have the broken piece of matzah. The Rambam, he says to break the matzah right before hamotzi, but not only right like after the Magid, but he actually breaks it after Natilat Yadayim, right? So you do rochza. So I'm trying to set the scene here. Imagine you're at the Seder. Everyone's sitting around. Everyone's washed. We're all sitting quietly. It takes, depending how big your Seder is, it takes half an hour for everyone just simply to wash at Seder night. And you're all sitting around the table. You're all sitting silently. And imagine the Baal Habayit gets up. And this is, picture the scene here for the Rambam. He picks up two matzot. They're both whole, right? And then what happens? In front of everyone, you're all sitting quietly. He dafka breaks one of them, right? Anyone who's accidentally broken one of their wives' homemade chalot, or had their chalot broken by their husband at Hamotzi, will know what I'm referring to. That it's kind of a tense moment where you've got the two chalas and one of them accidentally breaks, right? And then you've run out of lechem mishnah. It says the Rambam, dafka, deliberately you break them after Natilat Yadayim. You're ready to make hamotzi on two whole loaves, and then what do? At the last minute, just before hamotzi, you had two whole loaves. You were able to do lechem mishneh like Hilchot Yom Tov, and you dafka break it. That seems to be what the Rambam's trying to set here. He's setting the scene here. Dafka to break the matzah, to say no, this isn't a regular Yom Tov. We right now are having a pulsa. We're having a broken matzah because it's the element of the lechem oni, or the poor man's bread, that element of the matzah. And therefore, dafka, not earlier, where you could say, oh, it was already broken, what can I do? But dafka, after everyone's done it, Natilat Yadayim, you're about to make hamotzi, you had two whole matzahs in front of you, and therefore you deliberately break it as if to show lechem oni. And therefore, while we don't, again, halacha, we don't follow the halachic ruling of the Rambam, I think that there's an important message here about experiencing. So much so that even according to the position of the Rambam, that halacha of experiencing the prusa, the broken poor man's bread, the bread of a slave, the bread of affliction, the bread of a poor man, overrides halachot of lechem mishneh on Yom Tov. Because right now, it's true it's Yom Tov, but right now we're sort of transferring ourselves back. We're transported back to being an Eved in Mitzrayim in that particular moment. And just for the last couple of minutes, because I've many more such examples, but one of my other favorite examples, which I've sort of come across, is an idea I'd like to share with you, which is how the Rambam not only discusses the number of matzot in his position, but also what one does with them as well. If we look at source 14, the Rambam says as follows, in terms of the Seder of dipping. He says as follows, Says the Rambam. Let's see. Says the Rambam here, source 14. Is man hazeh at this point, she'ein sham korban, achar shem avarech hamotzi lechem, chozet mavarech al achilat matzah. At this point, when there's no korban anymore, we don't have korban pesach, so you make hamotzi. Somebody had pointed out here just in the chat, quite rightly, that it seems according to the Rambam, both pieces were still present at the time when you made the bracha of hamotzi, because unless the kids have been really quick to hide it for afikoman, but nonetheless, it's broken. And if it's broken, it makes it all the worse that you had the broken matzah and you deliberately broke it. Nonetheless, says the Rambam, what's the order of events? So after you make hamotzi with your one and a bit broken matzot, so chozem avrach al achilat matzah, like we do, you make the second bracha of al achilat matzah. And listen to this. What does the Rambam hold? Umetabel matzah b'charoset va'ochel. Don't know anyone seen this before, but this is the position of the Rambam. You then dip the matzah in the charoset and you eat it. And then you make a bracha al achilat marar, umetabel marar b'charoset. You dip the maror. So, okay, we know we dip the maror in the charoset and you eat it. But why is the Rambam saying here, in his opinion, which we don't traditionally follow, that you dip the matzah in the charoset? And the Ravid doesn't hold back. And in a concise comment, he has two words to say about the Rambam's comment. He says the Ravid there, right? The Rambam says, that you dip the matzah in the charoset. The Amma Avraham says the Ravid, two words, zehevel. This is vapor, meaning this is nonsense, right? I don't know where he got this from. The Rabbi doesn't say any more than that. He suffices with two words. He says, where did you get this from? You dip the matzah in the charoset? What's going on here? The Maggid Mishneh tries to come to the defense of the Rambam, and in general, we know he comes to the defense of the Rambam. He's not particularly happy with this critique here of the Rambam by the Ravid. The Ravid says that zeh hevel. So says the Maggid Mishneh there. The Rambam, it's true, the Rambam didn't give any explanation as to why, in the Rambam's view, you're supposed to dip the matzah in the charoset as well. But and in truth, which is what we rule, the halacha, we generally rule that you do not dip the matzah in the charoset. Maybe they did at the times of the Korban Pesach, but we don't do this. The nahagu and the minhag is not like the Rambam. Nonetheless, says the Maggid Mishneh, lo hayalo lahavil hadavar. That's a great play on words of the Ravid who said zehevel. This is nonsense, right? So says the Maggid Mishneh, the Ravid shouldn't have been mahavil the Rambam. And he shouldn't have accused him of hevel. Lahavil literally means to vaporize, right? Because hevel, he shouldn't have vaporized the Rambam. In other words, he shouldn't have accused the Rambam of hevel. Hilo davar reiku, because it's not without reason what the Rambam has said. I would just like to end off here by making a suggestion. It's possible that whilst there is no Korban Pesach, nonetheless the Rambam says to dip the matzah in the maror as well. The Rambam says to dip the matzah in the charoset rather as well, as not necessarily a din in Hilchot Matzah, as a rule or a requirement of Hilchot Matzah, because you're right, the matzah is not supposed to be dipped in anything, the maror is. Why would it nonetheless be that the Rambam says to dip the matzah in the charoset? It seems that it's part of the experience, and I'll put it in this way: if we're really being transported back to the Rambam as if we have left Mitzrayim, and we are eating a broken matzah, because even though we have lechem mishnah, poor people don't have lechem mishnah, and slaves don't have lechem mishnah. What do slaves also have all over their hands? You've got these builders. If anyone ever had a kablan come to do some building work for them, and they take their lunch break, and they get their 5-minute lunch break, and they've been painting your wall or whatever it is, they don't necessarily, no matter how much anyone has ever done Play-Doh or anything with their kids, will know the similar feeling, right? The similar sentiment. It doesn't, when you get your hands really dirty, when you're doing hard graft work, doesn't matter how much you clean your hands. When you're day and night working, you're a painter or you're a builder, and the charoset, which represents the cement, is all over your hands. You can try to scrub your hands as much as you want. You're going to have that residue for a while, and having to take your kids home. My kids after gun and having scrub is the worst part of their day and mine. But nonetheless, an eved who is a slave and is not a master of his own time doesn't have the luxury of going and washing his hands in boiling hot water. He has his 2 minutes to eat bread here and there. They throw him his scrap of broken matzah, his little piece of broken bread, his lechem ani. He's got to eat it in the here and there. And maybe I would suggest, just my own idea, it could be that that's what the Rambam's creating here. It's that sense of lechem ani, of the poor man's bread, And therefore, that poor man, like the painter who's got the paint on his hands, or the bricklayer who's got the mortar, who's not a master of his own time, but is a true Eved, he doesn't have that sense of of being a master of his own time. So of course, when he eats the matzah, he's going to have the ta'am, he's going to have the taste of the mortar on his hands. He's going to have that difficult experience, and it could be that's what the Rambam is hinting at to here as well. And therefore, says the Magid Mishneh, lo davar reku. It's not baseless, this idea that no, it could be really even the matzah has that ta'am of the charoset, because again, this is a Seder experience. So just to summarize, because our time is up, we've seen many ways here of how the Seder is not just a narrative and not just a story, it's not an abstract story, but is an experiential chinuch lesson. We spoke about the mitzvah of Sipur itself, about not just lir'ot, but according to the Rambam, lahar'ot, not just to envision, but to convey as if you've left Mitzrayim. We spoke about the requirement of ba'avur zeh, and lifting the matzah, or even, according to one opinion in the Gemara, having to be able to see the matzah to fulfill the experience. And of course, we spoke about how the requirements of experiencing the maror, about the matzah, the number of matzot, the order of when yachatz is performed, breaking the matzah, the charoset, perhaps even according to the Rambam, and also the requirements of drinking wine, kafidat hashvateh, according to the preference of the drinker, are all geared to have not just a Seder night, but to have Seder experience. In truth, that we can even say ba'avur zeh, but the experience we've gone through now should be one which is formative for us. And by Mim Ha'em, so too Bazman Hazeh as well. When we experience Nisim v'Niflot in our times, we're able to tap into that energy and really have that incredible experience. And we should be Zocher, just like in those days of Geula, the Geula Shlema, B'mheira V'yameinu. Amen.